Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today insists that God will forgive him and allow him into heaven, but I can't live with that. Welcome, Jon Towlson.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't think I ever said such a thing, and I have no such expectations either. But I must say, it's really nice to meet you. This is the first time that we've met, but I've been looking forward to this for a long time because we shared so many pages of magazines together and sort of DVD booklets, and obviously sort of our backgrounds are very similar. I think at sort of Nottingham Tykes, so it's lovely to be appearing on your show. So thank you very much for replying to me. I got in touch with Andrew and suggested that I come on to talk about Shane Meadows because I thought there'd be a lot in common there.
Yeah, no, it's good to get you on, and yeah, likewise. It's you know, like I said, we kind of shared a lot of the same pages of different magazines and things like that, and various Blu-ray boutique Blu-ray releases, which is nice. Yeah. So, what have you been up to?
Well, I don't know if you've seen. I've just put out a new book on cult cinema called 40 Cult Movies.
Yeah, I did,
and I've been pimping that to death, you know, on Twitter and so on, because it's a self-published book. It's my first self-published book, so I thought I'd do it as a little bit of an experiment to see what the interest would be in it. And so far, it's been good. So yeah, it's been taking up a lot of time.
So it's called 40 Cult Movies.
40 Cult Movies. So it's essays on 40 cult movies.
The beautiful cover by Graham Humphreys.
Yeah, lovely. It was a dream come true, really, to get Graham to do that cover, because you know, nobody says cult movies like Graham's paintings. So it was a wonderful opportunity to get such an iconic painter to contribute something.
Yeah, he was my guest on episode 2 as well. Yeah, he's an interesting chap, Graham. He's always gallivanting here, there, and everywhere. And yeah, like you said, he has kind of become, I think, you know, even though obviously he started off, you know, back in the 80s, and he did those brilliant sort of that fantastic British run of Evil Dead promotion stuff and all that. It's brilliant. But I think, you know, more recently he has become that. He is, you know, the visual signifier of kind of boutique horror, isn't he? You know, he's kind of just there. I mean, Arrow obviously does a lot of stuff at Arrow and other organizations as well. But, you know, if you've seen those beautiful new versions of classic horror films, that's, you know, and then you're wondering who that is. It's probably Graham Humphreys. So, yeah, what kind of stuff are you covering in the book then?
Well, there's you know, it's the diverse range really, from the better known titles. Alice, Sweet Alice is in there. There's Toto the Hero. And there's a couple of Romero movies, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and so, you know, some pretty obscure stuff like the Redeemer, Son of Satan, which is, I think, my favorite. There's that sort of Roger Corman mashup movie in the aftermath. So it's a disparate bunch.
Yeah, it's weird actually, because you know, talking to the sort of courses I do at the Broadway, I'm going to be doing another course in January, which is more about Hollywood and the mob and crime. But actually, the one I've got proposed after that is called. I think I can't remember what the title. I think the title is, if I remember correctly. I was a teenage zombie from Mars, something like that, and it's basically it is a kind of I was a teenage surfer zombie from Mars. That's it, and it's kind of like a beginner's guide to cult cinema. So whereas you've done 40, because of the way the courses work at the Broadway, I usually only get to do like 3 films per class. Yeah, I'm trying to work out how I can cram 100 years of cult cinema into 30 films, really. So yeah, there's going to be some interesting choices there, I think, because I think it's because you really want to touch upon, you can't really do. I mean, I'm kind of basing it, I guess, on the brilliant series, Channel 4 series from the late 80s, early 90s, the Jonathan Ross Incredibly Strange Film Show. That was kind of like my Bible at the time. I loved that, and
yes,
I think,
mine too. Yeah,
and I
in
think
fact, I mentioned that in the introduction to the book.
Yeah, I've got.
What is the attraction of these films? The films that Jonathan Ross once described as very strange or incredibly strange. He put out a couple of books as well, didn't he? A tie-in.
Yeah,
books.
I've got the first one. Yeah. Which is, it's really odd because I mean, this is what people forget. Jonathan Ross is such a media whore now. He's kind of who he is, and he's kind of the friendly face of ITV and all that. But it's really, people growing up in my, sort of our sort of age bracket, he really was that beacon. I mean, I remember Channel 4. I mean, people always talk about Channel 4 in the early days, it being groundbreaking and all that. I don't think it really hit its stride till sort of the late 80s. That's when I really started paying attention, because they had things like the Incredibly Strange Film Show, and you had Jonathan Ross's chat show called The Last Resort, which was, it wasn't about the normal, the kind of chat shows he does now. It's all very Hollywood and sort of mainstream. But then, he was having people on like John Lydon from Pill and all these kind of weird authors and people like that on. It was really interesting. And then you got like Incredibly Strange Film Show. But then other people, like you had Simon Drake doing The Secret Cabaret, all of this brilliant stuff. And I remember around 86 as well, Channel 4 did whole season of double bills, classic horror double bills, and they started right from sort of, they did all the kind of Universal stuff. So to me, and I remember them repeating Twilight Zone and things like that. So Channel 4 was just like an incredible, at that point, from the sort of mid 80s to the sort of early 90s, it was just a brilliant little place where you could go and find all this absolutely brilliant, in pre sort of DVD, pre-streaming, all of this brilliant stuff, whether it was brand new or they were repeating older stuff, like Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and all that kind of stuff. It was amazing. I loved it then.
Well, I think at the time they really did sort of live up to that sort of alternative broadcasting remit that they sort of came in on. But I mean, I do remember the Incredibly Strange Film Show, and it was quite a lavish production. I mean, Jonathan Ross, I remember in particular the one that he did on George Romero, and I think he did one on Sam Raimi as well. And he was traveling off to Pittsburgh and meeting Tom Savini and walking around with George Romero and visiting the locations of the films. So there was money being spent on the program. They didn't skimp on the details of it. And I think Ross was such a good ambassador at the time for cult movies because of his enthusiasm for them. There was a genuine enthusiasm that came across in the show and in the books as well. And I think that really is kind of what sparked it for me. Was his enthusiasm for it, and also at the time, I suppose there was the sort of Danny Peary books that came out in the 80s. Cult movies, and he was one of the few authors who was actually sort of talking about the movies. There was also Midnight Movies. I think Jonathan Hoberman. I can't remember the name of the author, but Yeah, so it was kind of like I suppose a burgeoning field at the time. But
Yeah,
yeah, I do remember those all of those shows that you talked about with those sort of alternative remits. So late night sort of Channel 4 on a Friday was the place to go, sort of after the pub, wasn't it, or with a few beers.
yeah, and I think past sort of by the time you got into sort of the later, well, sort of 93, 94, it started to change and it got a bit, it got a bit sort of drunk TV, didn't it? And it was the the word and all that, which had its kind of
Yeah,
moments, but it
yeah,
was but it wasn't that classic, things like I said, some stuff like Secret Cabaret. I mean, where else would that crop up at any other time in history or in any of the? It's just amazing. I loved it, and of
mm,
course, other things as well, like Vic Reeves' Big Night Out. People,
yeah, yeah. Great
you
fun.
know, Vic and Bob are very, Bob obviously with his fishing programs and that is very much a mainstream figure now, but people
Yeah,
forget just how fucking subversive and weird
yeah.
that was. I fucking
Well, Bo
love that.
Selector as well. Bo
Yeah,
Selector was
yeah,
kind of
yeah, 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 yeah,
mm,
yeah,
mm.
yeah. I mean, I know
But just
people.
great fun too, wasn't it? The
Yeah,
programming was fun as
yeah.
well. It
I
was
mean, people have
entertaining.
slagged off Channel 4, particularly more recently, and I think it's had its crit. But I just think, yeah, of course, it's had crap stuff on. But for me, in that period, which I'm talking about specifically, just incredible. Just really, really a
Mm.
massive, like, as that and as we've talked about before on this program, things like on BBC Two, Movie Drome and all that, that we forget. We really do
Yeah,
forget.
yeah.
We were
Mm.
spoiled in some ways. We were
Yeah,
very
yeah.
spoiled.
Oh, yeah. I remember the Alex Cox programs. It was really that was another big one, wasn't it? That kind of introduced a lot of people to those movies. I
Yeah.
suppose it was sort of like the time of the Big Brother and if Endemol and those people kind of coming in the 90s that sort of started, Channel 4 started to move more into the sort of mainstream, the sort of kind of popularity.
Yeah, but even something like Big Brother, I mean, if you look at the first series of Big Brother, it genuinely was kind of experimental. It was
Mm,
obviously,
yeah.
but the moment it became big ratings, you just knew
Hmm.
from the second series onwards it was going to be fully self-aware, and candidates weren't coming on as that in that kind of feel of this is a television experiment. They were coming on with agents, and it just that's the moment. That's when it dies. Really, I'm not saying it can't be entertaining, but yeah, it's a weird one. So John, when what was your entry point into horror then? I mean, where we've touched upon a few things there, but in terms of how you started to make a connection with horror.
Well, I mean, you put it so well in your book, Welcome to the Cheap Seats, about television becoming almost a kind of surrogate parent for, those of us growing up in the 70s and 80s into sort of working class families and so on. Parents were away working. In my case, my mum and dad, they were publicans, so we lived upstairs above the pub and they were downstairs, and I was kind of on my own with the television a lot of the time in the evenings, just kind of watching whatever I wanted. And that, at that time, it was horror was just in the firmament, really. I mean, it was everywhere. It was on children's television with Children of the Stones and programs like that. It was even in the sort of public information films with Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water. And, it was a time of The Exorcist coming out. And it was just seemed to be that everywhere you looked, there was horror. And if you were, a kid who was kind of into films or into comics or whatever, as I was, then it came on your radar pretty quickly. So really, I just kind of started. I didn't really get a chance to watch much. Maybe some of the later double bills when I got a little bit older, the sort of BBC double bills. But I used to collect comics and I used to collect film comics and film books and read about really these horror movies, and that really kind of sparked my interest and whet my appetite for them, and eventually got to see them really in the age of VCR And I remember probably around about 1982, kind of getting our first VCR, and used to rent them then. So the guy used to came around with radio rentals, and he brought two movies, and the one movie was Scanners. Two free movies for us to watch. One was Scanners, and I think the other one was Zombie Flesh Eaters. So he was kind of something like somewhere between an angel and a devil, sort of delivering these things into my lap, really, as a very young teenager. I was about 12 or something.
I think everybody ended up with, whether you wanted it or not, you ended up with a copy of Scanners. It just just appeared.
The Guild Home Video copy. Do you remember that one?
Yeah. Scanners is a great movie. I love that.
Well, yeah, you watch it and then you rewind the tape and you watch it again straight away. Because this stuff was very kind of much forbidden in a way to us. You didn't really, we didn't even have a cinema in the town I grew up in, which was Grantham. Just my family's from Nottingham, generations of from Nottingham, but we moved to Grantham when I was very young. No cinema. The days before VCR, long before the internet. 3 channels on the TV. Just, not if you're into horror or into movies, there's not very many opportunities. So of course, when VCR came out, the pre-cert days, I was just completely hooked and just rented everything and anything,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we spoke about it a lot on this, but yeah, it is that. I guess these films, I spoke about this actually. I've got another book coming out next year, which is it started off being about Ben Wheatley's A Field in England, but it really grew into something bigger than that, and it's kind of that is the basis of the book, but it's really about looking at England and horror and magic and history and all of this stuff kind of bouncing around. And but I think like you said, at a certain point, particularly in the 70s and to a degree in the 80s, but definitely in the 70s, it was, I mean, thankfully looking back, but yeah, I think there seemed to be a feeling that they were out to traumatize us as children, because you literally couldn't get away from it. Like you said, it was public information films. It was inherent within. I mean, a lot of children's television at that point, and I'm not talking about stuff that was on for adults and kids just watched. I mean, it was actually programmed as children's television. It was terrifying. Some of those episodes of Doctor Who were amazing, but just terrifying, and Children of the Stones, all that kind. I mean, one of my earliest memories and earliest kind of nightmare inspiring visual TV shows was Sky. I don't know if you remember Sky.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember the opening episode.
Yeah, that's it.
And I remember screaming to my mum to turn it off because I was so scared of it.
I don't think I ever got past the first episode.
No,
I remember that being the first thing I remember connecting. Right, here's this thing, television, and this is gonna affect the way I sleep or not sleep. I remember vividly that first episode, and it absolutely freaked me out. Of course, I love it now.
Of course, well, even the thought of the stuff was terrifying. I mean, it was years until I saw The Exorcist, but I remember my friends telling me about it. I must have been about 5 years old, 6 years old, but the thought of it was terrifying enough, and it was actually very, very traumatizing, to the point that I think when I got to be about 7 or 8 years old, you have this extraordinary sort of fascination but repulsion with horror as a child, is that in a way you use it I think to try and deal with some of the traumas of your own life and the traumas around you, and you're kind of attracted to it in that way. But at the same time, it can traumatize you. And The Exorcist was one of those that long before I ever saw it, I actually was traumatized to the extent that I think as a child, I actually had a bit of a nervous breakdown over it. Sleepless nights, wetting the bed, all linked into the thought of this film and the thought of what might happen to me, the possibility of what happens in the film happening to me as a child, the way you do in that sort of magical thinking that you have as a child. So horror, the relationship, I'm sure you feel the same way. The relationship that I have with the horror genre is very much a love-hate one because of what I went through as a child. And I think this does link in to Shane Meadows as well in terms of what we're going to talk about, Dead Man's Shoes.
That it's really interesting you say that about The Exorcist. Now, I've got a similar experience. Now, I didn't see it till I was 17 when I first saw it. But the first time I ever saw The Exorcist was at the cinema. Now, where I lived, so I'm in Nottingham now, but I lived in sort of Woodhouse and sort of in Ashfield and at the time I was living around Mansfield. And on a Sunday in Mansfield, you had the ABC cinema in Mansfield, and every Sunday they'd show horror double bills. And then one Sunday they were showing, I'm sure it was The Evil Dead and Exorcist. And I knew about The Exorcist, but I wasn't expecting it to be the way it was. I just thought it was just another, throwaway horror film. So I went to see obviously I'd seen The Evil Dead before, but I went to see The Evil Dead and The Exorcist, first time I'd ever seen The Exorcist on the big screen. Now, the kind of background to this is that I was getting all sort of therapeutic now, but no, I was on the cusp, I think, of coming to terms with, or not coming to terms with the fact that I was, because I was really tying into the fact that you said you had like a mini sort of nervous breakdown. I think I did too, and because it was the first time I'd ever really. I've suffered with mental health problems all my life, and I think that was the first time I'd ever really understood it as mental health issues. And I'm not blaming The Exorcist. I'm not that stupid, but I think I probably saw it for the first time at the wrong time, and it didn't help. And I think I started to attribute, because I was not in a good place, and it wasn't that, this is back in the 80s, the thought of a 17-year-old kid going to the doctors and saying, I'm having problems, could you help me? What wouldn't have come on my radar. So I kind of coped with this for a long time on my own. And I think, because you're not necessarily of sound mind, you start to attribute things like The Exorcist. So yeah, that film absolutely freaked me out for a lot of different reasons for a long time. Now, I absolutely love it now. It's one of my favorite films. I think it's brilliant, and I think it's an incredibly powerful film even now. And I love it so much. So, right. Even when, and one of the things I don't like is that they tend to show this obviously at Halloween, and obviously it's just had the 50th anniversary. So I don't like going to the cinema around Halloween to see horror films because it's full of amateurs. And I think
Halloween is every day for us.
Yeah, and you need to learn to behave when you're watching horror films.
Yeah.
Now, if I have to listen to an amateur laughing at The Exorcist again, I will go nuts. But yeah, for a long time, particularly in my teens and early 20s, that film really affected me deeply. But I think it was obviously to do with other aspects that were going on in my life. So yeah, but I still, every time I see it, I love it, and I've kind of got over a lot of that. But it's still, there is that connection there, and it is a powerful film. Whether you,
I think it keys into a lot of people's traumas, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's been such a monumental film over the years, and it probably goes to explain why some of the kind of hysteria that greeted it when it came out, because it keys into very, very sort of childhood traumas of persecution, being persecuted by some sort of evil outside force, being bullied, in effect, being abused, and it also keys into the idea that you might lose the love of your parents if you're naughty, as Reagan in the film, she sort of kind of loses the love of her mother, that fear of being abandoned. I think there are two very key sort of fears in that film that the movie plays on: the fear of loss, really, and it keys into it as a child, but those are fears that we'd never really let go of. It's the basis of so many sort of anxiety neuroses into adulthood. That I don't think if anyone suffers from those kind of, I don't know, I suppose you'd call them weaknesses within yourself, as I have, then you're kind of susceptible to it. I mean, it's still, as a film, it still kind of scares me now. I still have those moments, sometimes late at night if I'm on my own, and I start thinking about some of the images in the film. It still has that effect on me. It takes me right back to that sort of childhood trauma. And I don't know why, really, because when you get older, you can rationalize things away, you can understand them and kind of gain control over your fears in that way. But it still does hold a sort of frisson for me in that sense.
But everybody talks about, a lot of people talk about the kind of the extremes of The Exorcist, the masturbation scene and all this, and the sort of levitation and all that. But for me, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But it's the quieter moments. They're the most terrifying. They're one of the most frightening or disturbing moments in the entire film is when you get the two exorcists and they've been in there for the first time and they come out, and these are experienced men, but they are just broken, and they don't say anything. They just sit on the steps, and it's just like, and it's almost, the subtext is, what the fuck are we doing here? How are we going to sort this out? And it's brilliant. It's just such a powerful moment. It's brilliant. Friedkin, whatever you think about Friedkin, bless him, it's just I know he tortured his actors and everybody on set, and I know that it's very questionable of how he put this together. But, the finished thing is a fucking masterpiece. It is brilliant.
I've always found there's something harsh about Friedkin, a sort of a willingness not to flinch, and it's there in, I guess, the documentary realism of his other films. It's in The French Connection. It's definitely there in Cruising. He's a hard bastard. He was a hard bastard. And it took that, though, to make The Exorcist, didn't it? I mean, it could easily have turned into a big joke. Yeah, but this was a guy who was willing to really approach it in a very cold, matter-of-fact way, a very harsh way. I think, and I think that's one of the reasons why the film works as well as it does.
I think he was he's a really interesting director, and I think, as a questionable human being, possibly, and I've heard lots of interviews with him, and I think as much as there is that bluster, and as much as there is that kind of, the way he was and the way he kind of disregarded other people and could be quite rude or whatever, and certainly his politics were very questionable, I think. But he wasn't prepared to have people blow smoke up his arse either. He didn't stand for it. I remember one of the last interviews I heard, he was on the movies that made me, which is like Joe Dante's podcast, and and I think at first when they introduce him, he's kind of like, they're trying to, and he's like, no, I don't want any of that. I don't want any. Don't fucking try and paint me as this. I'm just this. And he was quite straightforward and down to earth in that way, so I kind of liked him. But yeah, you can't question his work. It's just fucking great. He's great filmmaker. Anyway, we're not here to talk about William Friedkin. No. We are here.
The Exorcist takes us over.
Yeah, we are.
Possesses us.
We are going to, we're going to introduce the film. So the film we're going to look at today is Dead Man's Shoes from 2003, as directed by Shane Meadows.
You get to me first. He ain't going away, fellas. He's got to get done. God will forgive them. He'll forgive them and allow them into heaven. I can't live with that.
Now, John, when did you first come across this film?
Well, I mean, Shane Meadows kind of came onto my radar fairly early on because, again, a lot of kind of shared background. Because in the 80s, I was actually got involved with film production in Nottingham, and there was a place called the New Cinema Workshop on Mansfield Road, which I think eventually amalgamated with Intermedia. And so I was kind of making my own little 16mm films, and kind of later on, I've heard that there was this guy, but this was a few years afterwards, called Shane Meadows, who was shooting little videos and stuff, and eventually kind of worked his way up to doing 24/7. And just finding out a bit more about him, I kind of wasn't as kind of interested so much in those early films, and Room for Romeo Brass, they didn't really sort of grab me. But when I saw Dead Man's Shoes, that was a movie that sort of really got me interested in Shane Meadows as a sort of director, in terms of the themes that he was exploring and the way he was sort of bringing out some of this kind of experience that I suppose if you will recognize it, and you write about it very eloquently in your book. So I know that you feel very much kind of this idea of what it's like to grow up in an environment in the Midlands, in the working class environment, being a teenager and having to deal with bullying, maybe having to deal with abuse, or at least witnessing other people dealing with it, and the drug problem of small towns and so on and so forth. So when I saw Dead Man's Shoes, I thought it was almost like a genre movie, that he was kind of taking the tropes of the classic exploitation movie, the sort of revenge tropes, but he was bringing into it his own experience, and then the experience of I think I could recognize, I'm sure you could recognize, and doing it very well. And so that movie really kind of it kind of touched me in a way that I thought, yeah, I kind of understand where he's coming from, and that sort of really keyed me into Shane Meadows. And then I didn't like Once Upon a Time in the Midlands much. I thought it was a bit spoofy. I don't think he likes it that much. But then when This Is England came out, I thought, this is a masterpiece, and we've been there. I'm sure you've been there in terms of the kind of thing you get up to as a young kid in the early 80s. And yeah, from that point, I was completely hooked. Yeah, so when This Is England came out, I think I just could kind of relate to the experiences that he was sort of relaying. And that goes back to Dead Man's Shoes as well, just kind of being able to see, the kind of experiences that I had sort of growing up in a small town sort of environment, and those some of the things that he was talking about in the film.
Yeah, I think This Is England Yeah, it's great. I think. I'm not. To be honest, to be fair, I mean, I've interviewed Shane Meadows, and he's a really
Mm,
great. He's a lovely guy. And I've interviewed Paddy Considine as well. Obviously, they're both connected with the film we're talking about. Yeah, I think that. But I'll get back to that. But in terms of This Is England, I think yeah, it is. What I liked about This Is England was the fact that Sean, the main character, was exactly the same age I was at the time when the film was set. So the first film is set in '83. So he's 13 and I was 13. And then um, what I liked is that when they did the TV show, the first TV show, obviously the first TV show is '86, and it's Sean leaving school when he's 16, as I was leaving school. And one of the very first shots is they show him doing a CSE history test, and that was the history test that I took, so it's like, and I
yeah.
failed as well, so I really liked that sort of that little franchise he built with the film and the series. I mean, I think to be fair, I think the film is much more successful than the TV shows. I think there's some great stuff in the TV shows, but I think there's a lot of stuff that's maybe not so great in the TV shows as well. But
Mm,
yeah, but This Is England, the film, I think, yeah, is fantastic, and I think it still
mm,
holds up, and I think it's really, really, it's just a great. I think Stephen Graham in that is just incredible. Just really, it's just such a nuanced performance, and
mm,
it's not your kind of typical he's a skinhead and he's evil. It's just it's way more grey than that, and it's much more grim than we can possibly imagine. We get hints of
mm,
it, but we never get the full backstory. But we understand just how grim that situation must have been for him.
mm.
Yeah, it's great.
I think a lot of this does kind of go back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about the kind of 70s childhood experience and getting into horror and things just kind of being a bit more of a harsher time then, and certainly parenting was very, very different in the 70s and 80s. I mean, now, of course, you have the phenomenon of the sort of helicopter parent where, the kids they pretty much have all their leisure activities sort of defined for them or organized for them, but when I was growing up in the 70s, and a lot of people I've spoke to have the same kind of experience, and I'm sure you probably have the same experiences, that we just left to our own devices, after school and at weekends. We were literally out the front. We were latchkey kids, really. And the parents didn't have a clue where we were or what we were doing half the time. And I think that's a lot of the reason why they had these public information films in the 70s, is just because, well, the government was aware that there were these kids just roaming the streets, and I was one of them, getting into all sorts of trouble. And these films took on the role of parents. So it was kind of, don't play in farms, don't play on electricity pylons, and I think a lot of it stems to that. But coming back directly to Shane Meadows, is that when you had that experience as a kid and you kind of getting involved with gangs, or you getting involved with older boys, and some of the people that you encountered, because you'd roam around, you'd have your group of friends, but you'd meet new kids as well, and some of them were quite troubled, and I think there was always the threat of bullying, there was the threat of abuse. And as I said before, I kind of known that sort of thing happening. What's happened to Shane Meadows, that he's kind of talked about, happened to him, the sort of sexual abuse episode that's happened to him, I've known that happened to other kids. I think it's probably happened to a lot of kids. So again, it's that shared experience, but it comes down to this idea of what childhood was like in those days in the 70s. And I think that's really what comes out in This Is England, is this kind of thing, is the absence of that kind of controlled parenting that we have now, whereas the kids kind of did their own thing and had to negotiate some of the real tough terrain of working class life as a child, when things were a lot it could turn quite brutal. I was lucky because I had long legs and I used to run, and I would just develop this kind of sensor for trouble, and I knew to stay away from the kids who could be trouble. But often people didn't do that and they got involved in all sorts of things. And a lot of the kids that I knew, they ended up going to special schools and borstals and all of the rest of it. So when you kind of see the relationship between Sean and Combo in This Is England, you really recognize some of those things, and some of it is so specific. I mean, I I remember the National Front times and the Combat 88 times, and these lads used to go around and they used to enlist you, and if you were like me, a sort of lad who was looking for an older brother type figure, they would take you under their wing. And one such lad, who wasn't anything like as kind of organized as Combo, but I remember going around, and this is kind of shameful really, but going around with him, and he's kind of spouting all of this National Front stuff, and I'm kind of listening to it, kind of not really believing it, but just glad to have like this older brother character who sort of seemed to have taken an interest in me. So, and I'm sure that happened to a lot of kids, but Shane Meadows has just managed to express it so incredibly well. But also what goes through all of his films from Romeo Brass is this idea of that there are people who are very troubled, and sometimes you don't recognize them immediately. It's only when you kind of get drawn in to a friendship with them that you realize that these people are potentially violent, potentially dangerous, and that violence can just sort of erupt out of nowhere. I mean, I just remember that happening to me, saying the wrong thing and suddenly somebody turning on me, and you think, where did this come from? And you realize this person is dangerous, potentially dangerous.
Yeah, well, I think
it just captures that feeling of what it was like to be in that situation so incredibly well, because I think it happened to him. And maybe at the time he didn't realize that this was what he was talking about through his films. So it kind of comes through in a sort of codified way in some ways, and I think Dead Man's Shoes is very much like that. It is it's about those things, but it's in a form of a sort of I don't know, a sort of genre movie, horror movie kind of form.
You'd had 24/7, and I think you'd had, and obviously Room for Romeo Brass, and both of those looked at these kind of bizarre or troubled relationships, and looked at this idea of this erupting into violence and abusive relationships. So in Room for Romeo Brass, obviously Paddy Considine plays a character that is in one sense laughable, but very, when placed into the context of a childhood relationship, is very dangerous. And then in 24/7, you'd had the kind of domestic abuse, violence storyline, and then obviously in This Is England, you've got this eruption of violence towards the end. But I think with Dead Man's Shoes, it was a kind of departure, and I think it is a very Shane Meadows film, absolutely, but it is a kind of very un-Shane Meadows film as well, and I think that it has. And I think it does things that are very clever. It is because, like I said, I interviewed Shane Meadows a few weeks back, and because we were screening the 20th anniversary, it's 20th anniversary of this film, and it still feels fucking strange that it's 20 years old. But the first question, the first thing I asked him was whether he, it's kind of like whether he was aware of kind of genre cinema, whether he was aware of how much this would be adapted by sort of cult horror fans, because it bombed at the box office, didn't do very well, and it sort of picked up this cult following later on sort of DVD and whatever. But I think, you know, the horror community really does embrace this film, and I think that's why it stands out. But I think it's interesting because it is, whether Shane Meadows wanted it to be or not, it is a kind of horror film, but it takes that idea of the serial killer, and rather than it being in the sort of overly lit streets of New York or whatever, it just places it into those council house settings, or that sort of shitty little enclave of working class culture or whatever, you know, pit towns or Peak District, and by doing, you know, similar to the sort of aesthetic of something like Ben Wheatley, when you with Sightseers, where you've got these two serial killers who are on holiday caravanning, you know, and it is comical in some ways, but it also creates this edge that you're not expecting. Because I think the gang in This Is England is really interesting. You know, you've got what's his name? What's the name of the boxer guy? And Gary Stretch, who plays Sonny, who kind of leads the little gang, and they are, from our point of view, that is very recognizable to me. Like you were saying about This Is England, that idea of the small time hoodlums who basically they are in charge, but what they're in charge of is an absolute fucking shithole. And it's just, you know, and the fact that they drive around in this knackered old Citroen, you know, and it's just, they are kind of laughable, but incredibly dangerous as well. You know, it's this idea of, you know, you know, having never been sort of part of criminal elements myself, but I always kind of, but I've been I've grown up in environments where that was on the edges of it all the time. It was always to me, well, you're breaking the law, and I can get why people want more money and stuff, but it never seemed to me that these people had anything worthwhile. You know, you're risking going to jail for stuff that was a bit shit. So I never really got it, and I think
well, these guys are not the main guys, are they?
No,
I think,
no.
I mean, I just think that actually this is another. You say it's 20 years old, but actually this is where the film is quite prescient. I think in its portrayal of the small town drug gang. You know, and of course this is a problem. If anything has got worse for small towns in England, is that you do get the county lines thing where you've got the drugs coming in from the cities, you know, so, you know, you've got drugs coming in from Derby and Nottingham going into these small towns, Matlock and Heanor and all of those kind of, you know, Derbyshire towns. And they may, you know, they take the form of the drug gangs, but they also take the form of the sort of money laundering in things like the car washes and the nail bars and so on. And it's literally, in this country, in some areas, it's becoming so upfront, it's almost like Breaking Bad, you know, in the sense that these people are doing it on our high street. So why shouldn't we be doing it? You know, there's that kind of sense there with the gangs. But coming back to what you were saying about This Is England, the TV show, again, I agree with you that it didn't have the sort of tightness or the focus of the film, but what was good about it was the Vicky McClure character, and it's kind of what happened to her, and it comes back to that kind of abuse thing that Shane Meadows is kind of obsessively kind of exploring in his films.
I think this is the thing. See, I'm, you know, this is like sacrilege, and I'm not supposed to say this. And I did kind of interview Vicky McClure sort of via email and stuff, but I'm not a massive fan. I don't think she's great. I think she's brilliant at Loz. I think she's fantastic at that role. I don't think she's great in other stuff. I don't know whether it's because she's miscast or I don't know, but I don't.
Well, it's just kind of going on to what I was about to say there. What's kind of lacking from that that makes some of the other characters more real in a way, and especially those the small town drug dealers of Dead Man's Shoes, is that humor. There's almost a kind of grotesque humor thing going on there that Shane Meadows does extremely well. And as you say, it gives it a real edge. I mean, one of the best sequences in Dead Man's Shoes for me is when Gary Stretch answers the door and his face has been all painted up as a clown. I mean, it's such a funny but grotesquely funny moment. And what's so real, but it's real, very real. And the reactions of the gang to him is they're absolutely spot on. You know, there is no reaction. They're just kind of looking at him going, what the fuck is going on here?
I mean, you could see from a script point of view, that might be a kind of almost like a throwaway gag, but it's really,
it's so
really
real.
clear. It's really,
so real.
you know, it's really sort of illustrating that, you know, Sonny thinks he's Scarface, but he's just a fucking joke. That's the thing.
He's just a small fish.
Yeah.
You know, he's not the Mr. Big. He's a guy who is probably getting the consignments in from somebody who is big in the city, and he's set himself up as this big fish in a small pond drug dealer, but he's really just a middleman, isn't it? You know, so it's the kind of pretense, as you say, of the characters. But I think what makes it so good with that gang is the casting, and I'm pretty sure that part of Shane Meadows' process is that he casts actors who really understand that world. You know, they might not come from that world, but they will have some sort of experience of it. And I actually I did know the guy who plays Tough, the guy who drives the 2 CVs, Paul Sado. He grew up in Grantham, in the town I grew up in, and I was in a couple of plays with him when we were sort of about 16 and 17. And what I remember about him is his sense of humor. He just had this really kind of dark sense of humor. Really, he really understood the kind of the ironies of life, you know. So I can imagine that part of the casting process is that you get these people who share that kind of sense of humor and share that kind of understanding of those kind of environments. And Paul would have understood small town life in the Midlands because he would have grown up into it as well. So I think, you know, they bring this thing to it that they literally, if they're not those characters, and I think some aspects of that character is Paul, but they recognize these people. They would have, you know, seen them on the periphery as we have. And I think that's why they're able to make it so real, you know. And some of the little conversations they have at the beginning, where they're kind of reading through porno mags, you know, some of the throwaway comments, it's kind of like I can hear my brother and his mates when I was a kid kind of listening to some of the things they would say.
Well, I think that's kind of the genius of Shane Meadows. I think he lets
filmmakers are just brilliant at portraying people in their natural habitats, aren't they? And he's one of those. He, you know, he said that he was very inspired by Scorsese and Mean Streets, and how well Scorsese had managed to kind of give the smell of those kind of that environment, you know. And I think Shane Meadows has that same quality as a filmmaker for me, that he really is able to do it so well because he's from there, you know. He's not a middle class London filmmaker who's going up north to make a kitchen sink drama that is no personal experience of. He's from there, you know. He's kind of dyed in the wool, and I think that's what, for me, it kind of made me really get turned on to his films, just thinking that this guy's a genuine article. And people have described him as, you know, the best filmmaker of his generation, and I think he is, for those reasons, for me anyway.
Well, I mean, if we go back specifically to Dead Man's Shoes, so we've got this is very much in the fold of I mean, people often talk about British films and British horror and folk horror and things like that, but this is kind of a slightly different subgenre. This is what I would tend to call kitchen sink horror. You know, it's and you know, it's very much in a similar sense to, say, Bull or Kill List, or even, you know, from America, looking at something like Martin. Martin is very much a working class, blue collar sort of version of the vampire, and I think it can really work. I think if it's overdone, it's not so great, and if it's very very aware that it's trying to do that and not very successfully, it's got to be done by filmmakers, like you say, like Shane Meadows, who understand that background and understand those streets. You can't just do council estate horror if you've never really understood what growing up on a council estate is like. And so the authenticity is there. But I think at the absolute center of this, you've got two incredible performances. I mean, pretty much everybody in it is good, but the two incredible performances are the two main characters of Anthony and Richard, played by Toby Cabell and Paddy Considine. Now, we'll come back to kind of Paddy Considine in a second, I think, but Toby Cabell. Now, I don't know if you're aware, when I was speaking to Shane Meadows, I was asking him about this, because for me, there's massive parallels between this and What's Eating Gilbert Grape. In terms of, you see in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, you've got, for most people, that was the first time they'd ever come across DiCaprio in this incredible performance, which kind of leads you to believe, when you first see What's Eating Gilbert Grape, I mean, one of the first questions I had, well, does this guy actually have learning difficulties? You didn't know, because it was such a convincing performance. And I think the same can be said about Toby Cabell. I think the weird thing is, though, this is what I was talking to Shane Meadows about, is that there was another guy lined up to do that role, and at the last minute he had second thoughts about portraying someone with learning difficulties, and he didn't want to do it. And so really, Toby Cabell was kind of lined up in the background, and they were about, I think they were going to be filming the next day, and Toby Cabell got the call, and he kind of basically put that character together on the train over. And Shane Meadows said, he just got it straight away. It was like, it saved me so much work because he understood it. And it is, I mean, I know Toby Cabell's gone on to do other things and, Hollywood and whatever, Black Mirror and all that kind of stuff. But this is just amazing. It's just what a performance. What a fucking great performance.
I mean, I've never thought about the links with Gilbert Grape, but that's very interesting you say that. I mean, it's the partly the idea of the vulnerability of the character, and the way he's kind of exploited and abused because of his vulnerability. But the idea in Gilbert Grape that Johnny Depp comes to realize his responsibility towards this boy, and I guess in a way that's kind of carried through in Dead Man's Shoes, which is sort of Paddy Considine's kind of almost overwhelming sense of responsibility and even guilt, that he might have let his brother down by not being there, which is I think probably the thing that propels the performance. But there's something also going on there, which is the idea of revenge, isn't there? Which is kind of a slightly more troubling. The idea that I don't know. I think you've interviewed Shane Meadows. I've read in the past how partly the film was inspired by him going back to Uttoxeter and kind of seeing what had happened to the place, how it had become very run down and kind of overtaken by these drug gangs, but also the memory of a friend of his or somebody he'd known who'd got involved with that world, and it had sort of destroyed him, and it had been just kind of discarded or forgotten by the town. And this desire or feeling on Shane Meadows' part that there had to be some sort of justice exacted, for what had been done to this boy, and Dead Man's Shoes almost being kind of like a wish fulfillment fantasy, which again is quite a troubling or problematic idea when you think about the sort of the death wish genre. The idea that you go in and exact vengeance outside of the law on people who are sort of wrongdoers. Again, it kind of gives the film a bit of a queasy feeling, doesn't it? Because you think you can't really get on the side of Paddy Considine because of what he does. He becomes the monster as he comes to realize at the end of the film, which I think is the right ending for the film. Really, is that he kind of realizes he's kind of gone too far, that it's not the right thing to do, it's not the way to solve the problem.
Well, I think because it's such a there's kind of like a few twists, I think, at the end. You've got, as you say, Paddy Considine realizing that he's gone too far. You've got obviously the big reveal of Anthony not being no longer with us, and whether we see this as a semi paranormal film or not, or whether we just see it as literally as Richard being haunted by the thought of his brother, however we see that. But also, so that is a great reveal. But also it's the fact that he eliminates the people we've seen as being the antagonists not fairly quickly, but before the end of the film. So we think, well, where is this going to go? And tragically, there's one more person, and this person, while Sonny and the gang have just ended up still stagnating and being terrible people, you've got one guy who's kind of got away, improved his life, tried to transform and be a better person, and he still can't escape. That's an interesting way to go, I think, and it's not where you're expecting it to go. So I think you've got this double whammy of a twist at the end.
And also it works so well with what Considine does so well as an actor, as you say, is it's almost that sort of Jekyll and Hyde aspect of the characterizations that he performs. And wasn't he in Tyrannosaur? Was it the film Tyrannosaur?
Yeah, well, he wrote that.
And he's doesn't he? Does he? I'm sorry, my memory is a bit vague on that film. Is he in that film, or does he just write it and direct it?
No, he's not in it.
Peter Mullen.
It's Peter Mullen who's in it. Yeah,
right. But but it's the same kind of character, that person who is on the surface, an affable character, but underneath, deep down, he's got this terrible anger, or proclivity towards violence. And again, it just seems to be something that Considine does extremely well. He really manages to portray that kind of damaged individual.
Yeah, he's good. He's a brilliant actor, and I think he's a good writer as well. And I think that something like Tyrannosaur was great. I interviewed him when he was doing the publicity rounds for Journeyman, and I think and I know that film didn't necessarily go down the way he wanted it to go down. I don't think it was as successful as he wanted it, and he's a nice guy, Shane Meadows. Paddy Considine, but I think it was kind of weird interview as well. I mean, I'd spoke to him before. I didn't just do a cold interview. I'd kind of been with the green room, but he was kind of with his agent, and I think his agent was a little bit sort of in your face sort of thing, and he because I was there to talk about Journeyman, and 90% of the questions were about Journeyman, and I was going to ask him about Room for Romeo Brass and Dead Man's Shoes, and he didn't want to talk about them at all. He would not touch upon them. He would not be drawn on that at all. And I know, I think he did have a bit of a falling out with Shane Meadows. I don't know what the relationship's now, but yeah. So it's a weird interview. But God, he's fucking incredible talent, And I think, the first series of House of Dragon is, wow, what a performance that is. I mean, just this idea of him being this king on this descent of him getting older and more decrepit and literally falling to pieces. It's just, it's a great. He can absolutely pull it out of the bag when he wants to. He's a great actor, I think. And he can work, he can do those kind of Shane Meadows small productions, or you kind of more Hollywood style films. I think he's just an absolute natural. He's brilliant.
He has a sort of quality quiet menace, doesn't he? In Dead Man's Shoes, it's like with a smiler with a knife sort of character.
Yeah, and I think the way in which the character Richard, he is a great kind of serial killer. I mean, your sympathies kind of are with him at the beginning, but as
Mm,
he goes on, he whatever we think about this gang, and they are horrible people, but he kind of tortures them, doesn't he? I don't.
mm,
I mean, he starts off by taunting them and letting them know that he can come at them whenever he wants because he's in charge, as he famously says in the film to Sonny. I've got you right there.
mm.
All of this kind of stuff, but then you know, actually dosing them with various forms of hallucinogens and then getting rid of them and showing them the dead body in the suitcase and all that. It's grim. It's grimmer than a lot of upfront horror films are, I think, and because
Yeah,
it's got that edge to it, because you're not expecting it, because it's this small town situation.
there's a kind of element of psychological torture going on that is you don't often get that in horror films. But maybe does that key into what you were saying about kitchen sink horror? Because this is the first time I've ever heard anybody use that phrase, and it's a sort of intriguing phrase of kitchen sink horror. But what other examples would you give of kitchen sink horror?
Well, like I said, I mean, I mentioned a few like Bull and Kill List.
Yeah.
You kind of Ben Wheatley kind of stuff. Things like Martin from America as well. I think it's just this idea of so it's not, I think you've got your classic kind of gothic haunted house type horror, or
Mm,
your American suburban sort of slasher films. And, I'm generalizing here, but
mm,
I think there is a
yeah.
kind of enclave, particularly when it comes to Brit. And I would also kind of, talked about this as well. A lot of your Amicus films, I think, they were very different to a lot of times they were very different to your Hammer horror films. Hammer horror was obviously very technical and gothic, but Amicus they ushered in, a lot of the times, they ushered in these kind of more kitchen sink elements, or these kinds of, one of my favorite Amicus anthologies is From Beyond the Grave. And I love the fact that you've got Peter Cushing doing this kind of Yorkshire accent, and you've got the section of the film, the section where you've got Donald Pleasance and his daughter, and that's you've got Diana Dawes as this horrible sort of this housewife and this henpecked husband. It's brilliantly claustrophobic and kitchen sink. It's fantastic, and I love that
Mm,
about Amicus. I love Hammer films, but I love the kind of tawdriness of the Amicus films. So I'm always kind of attracted to that, and it is although you've got like blue collar sort of horror films in America, like your Romero's Martin and Dawn of the Dead and stuff like that. Yeah, I think British horror is very different, because it very often combines that idea of the fantastical with the more mundane. As I've said before, it's the acid tab dropped into the builder's tea. That's kind of horror.
yeah, yeah. I guess there is that tradition as well. If you think about sort of Pete Walker's films
Yeah.
from the 70s, there's that kind of, I guess that's more of a sort of like a suburban horror. There's the horror of the kind of suburban areas.
But it's that
But
tackiness and that that graininess, and just the 70s, people were generally not as healthy as they are now in terms of food and diet and stuff like that. Everybody smoked,
yeah,
and it's the baked beans, it's the fucking spilled
yeah,
cornflakes, it's all of that. It's just all going into that. I love it. It's just a brilliant
yeah,
aesthetic.
yeah. And Shane Meadows does it so very well because he's got the sense of authenticity to it. And there's also a sense of sympathy, I think, for everybody. Nobody's really vilified. Everybody has their reasons. Everyone's kind of like a victim of their environment. And that, I think, sets Shane Meadows' films and Dead Man's Shoes especially aside to the kind of hoodie horror movies like Eden Lake, you know, where it's very much is that sort of chav, vilify the sort of chav sort of aspect to it. So for me, that makes it all the more horrific because there are no easy demarcations of monster and normality, no easy sort of distinctions made between good and evil and so on. It's all very, very much blurred together, and everybody's kind of affected by it and can't kind of extricate themselves from it.
People who commit evils in God's eyes are not beyond redemption.
Okay, so John, do you want to tell us where you can buy your book from?
You can buy it from Amazon. You can get it on Kindle, hardback, paperback, but Amazon's the place to go.
Brilliant. Okay, yes, quick plug from me. Just make sure. Yeah, I mean, if you want to check out my book on British working class cinema, which has a whole chapter on Shane Meadows, it's called Welcome to the Cheap Seats, Silver Screen Portrayals of the British Working Class, and it's published by Five Leaves, and you can buy it anywhere you buy your books from. So yeah, and also as well, in terms of podcast, T for Terror, please like, subscribe, all that jazz, writer's review, blah, 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 blah. It just remains for me to say thank you to my guest, Jon Towlson. Thanks for coming on, mate. It's been really good chat.
It's been brilliant. And everybody out there, go and buy Welcome to the Cheap Seats. It's a fantastic book. And I'd say if you're in Nottingham, go and buy it from the Four Leaves bookshop, because that's a wonderful...
Five Leaves
bookshop.
Yeah.
I've not been I've not been to Nottingham for a while. From the Five Leaves bookshop. It's a really wonderful bookshop.
Yeah. So remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.